Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1: The Room That Forgets You. The new beginning. Anna was desperate for a fresh start. After her divorce, she left her bustling city life for the quiets of a small town. When she stumbled upon the old Victorian house for rent, it seemed like fate. It was charming, affordable, and large enough to help her feel far from her past life. The landlord, Mr. Greaves, was a frail man who seemed eager to hand over the keys. "You'll love it here," he said, his voice raspy. "Just don't mess with the room at the end of the hall." Anna laughed nervously. "Why? Is it haunted?" Mr. Greaves gave a weak smile but said nothing more. When she moved in, the house felt warm and inviting. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, and the scent of lavender lingered in the air. She spent her first day unpacking, arranging furniture, and imagining her new life. As the sun set and the house grew quiet, she noticed something odd. A door at the end of the upstairs hallway, which she hadn't opened yet, seemed darker than the rest. It wasn't locked, she'd checked, but she couldn't recall why she hadn't gone in. The strange door curiosity got the better of her. Anna approached the door, her steps echoing in the silent hallway. When she turned the knob, a chill ran through her. The room was ordinary. It was unfurnished, with wooden floors and pale blue walls. The window was sealed shut, its glass slightly fogged, yet something about it made her uneasy. The air felt heavier here, like the room had been holding its breath. "Just another room," she muttered, closing the door behind her. That night, Anna dreamed of the room. In her dream, it was filled with people, all whispering and pointing at her. She couldn't make out their faces, but their voices grew louder until she woke up in a cold sweat. Shaking it off as stress, she resolved to ignore the room. But the house had other plans. The forgotten morning. The next morning, Anna woke up feeling disoriented. Her coffee mug was missing from the kitchen, even though she distinctly remembered leaving it on the counter. "Must have misplaced it," she told herself, though the small anomaly left her unsettled. As the days passed, other oddities emerged. Keys would disappear, only to reappear in strange places. Photographs on her phone were missing, and the living room clock started ticking backward every evening at dusk. Then there were the neighbors. They were polite but distant, as though they didn't quite register her presence. When she mentioned the house, their faces would change, their smiles faltering. "It's lovely," one neighbor said, her tone uneasy. "Just be careful. The room takes notice." Anna couldn't ignore the door any longer. One evening, she found herself standing in front of it again, drawn by an inexplicable pull. When she opened the door, the room had changed. The pale blue walls were now an off-white, and a mirror hung on the far wall. She could see her reflection, but it looked wrong. Her reflection blinked when she didn't, and its movements lagged ever so slightly. Anna slammed the door shut, her heart pounding. She called a friend from her old life, desperate for connection. "It's probably just the stress of moving," her friend said. "New houses always feel weird at first." Anna tried to believe it, but the feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. Disappearances begin. The next morning, Anna noticed the framed photo of her parents on the mantel was gone. She tore the house apart searching for it, but found nothing. Later, she tried calling her parents. Number didn't connect. Confused, she looked up their address online, but no record of them existed. Panic set in as she realized that her memories of them were growing faint. Their faces blurred in her mind, and even their names escaped her. Frantic, Anna opened the door to the room again. This time, it wasn't empty. The mirror was still there, but now there was a chair in the center of the room, facing the mirror. On the chair sat her missing photo frame. The image of her parents faded almost to nothing. A whisper echoed in the room. "Do you remember?" Anna fled, slamming the door behind her. The forgotten calls for help. Terrified, Anna tried to contact her landlord. When she called his number, a stranger answered. "There's no Mr. Greaves here," the voice said. "You must have the wrong number." When Anna drove to his listed address, the house was abandoned, covered in ivy, and boarded up. Desperate, she contacted the town's records office. The clerk gave her an odd look when she mentioned the house. "There's no record of anyone living there in decades," he said. Anna's stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I just moved in." The clerk shrugged, unconvinced. "Well, maybe you've got the wrong place." The room fights back. Returning to the house, Anna felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The hallway seemed longer, the shadows darker. When she checked her belongings, more items were missing. Clothes, books, even her laptop. Her phone had no contacts, and her call history was wiped. The room at the end of the hall felt alive now, its presence suffocating. She could hear faint whispers behind the door, like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. That night, she dreamt of the room again. This time it was filled with faceless figures, their hands reaching for her, their whispers accusing, "You forgot us." The final confrontation, Anna couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a hammer, she stormed into the room, determined to destroy whatever was inside. But the room was no longer empty. It was filled with her belongings, items she hadn't seen in days, piled haphazardly in the corners. The mirror was gone, replaced by a door on the far wall. It was identical to the one she had just entered, but this one had no handle. As she approached, the door creaked open on its own, revealing an endless void of darkness. A voice spoke from the void. "Do you want to remember?" Terrified but determined, Anna stepped forward. The truth revealed inside the void, Anna saw flashes of memories. Her childhood, her friends, her marriage, and her divorce. But the images were distorted, as if they didn't belong to her. Then she saw herself, standing in the room, staring into the mirror. Only it wasn't her, it was her reflection, and it was smiling. "You were never meant to leave," the reflection said. The void began to collapse, the memories unraveling like threads. Anna screamed, trying to hold on to something, anything, but everything slipped away. The new tenant. Anna woke up in the living room, the morning sun streaming through the windows. The house was quiet, peaceful, but when she checked her phone, it was blank. The few items she had left were generic, devoid of any personal connection. She walked upstairs, her feet heavy. The door to the room at the end of the hall was wide open. Inside, the room was empty again, except for a single photo on the floor. It was of her smiling in front of the house, but the name on the mailbox wasn't hers. The doorbell rang. Anna opened it to find a young couple standing on the porch, holding a lease agreement. "We're the new tenants," the man said. "Are you the landlord?" Anna opened her mouth to protest, but couldn't remember why. The cycle continues. The couple moved in that evening. Anna, now a shadow in the house, watched from the room at the end of the hall. As the door closed, she smiled, her reflection staring back from the mirror. The house never forgets, even if you do. Story 2, The Singing Tree. Nestled deep in the heart of Eldermire Woods was a place known only in whispers, a grove few dared to tread. Locals called it the Siren's Hollow, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and dread. The grove held a single ancient tree that stood taller than anything else in the forest. Legend had it that the tree sang, its haunting melodies echoing through the woods at night, luring the unwary to their doom. For years, no one in the nearby town had ventured close, their fear fed by generations of chilling stories. But to a group of 4 friends, Emma, Will, Sam, and Liz, Siren's Hollow was a challenge. They had spent years chasing urban legends, documenting their adventures on their growing YouTube channel, Dark Discoveries. When Emma brought up the singing tree, the others were immediately intrigued. The thought of venturing into uncharted territory, finding the source of the haunting songs, and capturing it on video was too tempting to resist. Even Liz, usually the cautious one, agreed to the plan. By the time they packed their gear and set out, excitement masked the underlying tension in the air. Eldermeyer Woods stretched out before them like a sea of green, dense and foreboding. The wind rustled the treetops, carrying with it the faintest echo of a melody, soft, lilting, almost too faint to be real. The first day of hiking was uneventful. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the forest became. Birds and insects seemed to vanish, leaving behind an oppressive stillness. That night, as they set up camp, the four friends felt the weight of the forest pressing down on them. The first song came at midnight. It began as a low hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground. Liz was the first to notice it, her eyes snapping open as the sound grew louder. Soon, it filled the air, a mournful melody that sent shivers down her spine. She shook the others awake, and together they listened in awe and fear. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "Beautiful," Sam replied, clutching his flashlight. "It sounds like someone crying." Will grabbed his camera, aiming it toward the direction of the sound. "This is it," he said, adrenaline masking his apprehension. "Let's go find it." Liz hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay put. "Maybe we should wait until morning," she suggested. But Emma was already packing her gear, her determination unwavering. "We'll lose the sound by then," she argued. "If we don't go now, we'll miss it." Reluctantly, Liz followed. Forest at night was an entirely different beast. Shadows danced between the trees, and every step seemed to echo unnaturally. The song guided them, growing louder and more distinct as they moved closer. It wasn't a single voice but many, harmonizing in a way that was both enchanting and unsettling. When they finally reached the grove, the sight stole their breath. The tree stood in the center, its trunk massive and gnarled, its branches twisting like veins against the night sky. The air around it shimmered faintly, as if the tree itself was alive. Will raised his camera, capturing every detail. "We've got it," he said, a mixture of triumph and unease in his voice. Emma stepped closer, drawn by the melody that seemed to emanate from the tree's core. The others watched in silence as she reached out, her fingers brushing the rough bark. The singing stopped. A deafening silence followed, so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the grove. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. The friends froze, their eyes darting around the grove, searching for the source. "Did you hear that?" Liz whispered, her voice barely audible. The whispers grew louder, words forming amidst the cacophony. "Leave." Emma stumbled back from the tree, her face pale. "It's coming from the tree," she said, her voice shaking. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, and filled with malice. Without warning, the ground beneath them trembled. Roots burst forth, writhing like serpents as they reached for the group. The friends scattered, their screams piercing the night. Liz ran blindly through the woods, her flashlight flickering as she tripped over roots and branches. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more personal. "You'll never escape," they hissed. She finally stopped, panting and terrified. She realized she was alone. The others were gone, and the forest had changed. The trees were closer together, their branches intertwining like cages. The path she had taken was gone, replaced by an endless sea of shadow. Meanwhile, Emma, Will, and Sam found themselves back at the grove, though they had no memory of how they got there. The tree loomed over them, its bark now pulsing with a faint, eerie glow. "This isn't possible," Will said, his voice cracking. "We ran in different directions." Emma stared at the tree, her fear giving way to a strange sense of calm. "It wants us here," she said. Sam grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." The ground trembled again, and the roots surged upward, forming a barrier around the grove. The tree's melody returned, but this time it was darker, more menacing. The glow from the tree intensified, and shadows began to form at its base. They were humanoid, but their features were warped, faces twisted in eternal agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Will raised his camera, but the device sparked and died in his hands. The figures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. The friends backed away, their fear reaching a breaking point. "This can't be real," Sam muttered, his voice shaking. Emma's calm demeanor shattered. "It's real," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We're not getting out of here." Liz, still wandering the forest, heard the melody change. It was no longer distant. It was inside her head, pulling her back toward the grove. Her feet moved of their own accord, each step dragging her closer to the tree. The whispers grew louder, taunting her, reminding her of every mistake, every regret. When she reached the grove, she found the others cornered by the shadowy figures. Emma was on her knees, her hands pressed to her ears as the melody overwhelmed her. Liz screamed, the sound cutting through the whispers. The figures paused, their heads snapping toward her. The tree's glow dimmed, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. "Liz," Will said, his voice hoarse, "we need to destroy it." "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. He pointed to the tree's roots, which pulsed with the same eerie glow as its bark. "It's feeding off us. We need to cut it off." Sam produced a knife from his pack and began hacking at the roots. The tree let out a piercing shriek, its branches thrashing violently. The shadowy figures lunged, their movements more frantic, more desperate. Liz and Will fought them off, using whatever they could find as weapons. Emma, still paralyzed by the song, watched helplessly as her friends struggled. Sam's knife finally cut through one of the roots, and the tree's glow dimmed further. The figures dissolved into smoke, and the grove fell silent. The friends collapsed to the ground, their breaths ragged. The tree stood motionless, its glow gone, its branches still. "We did it," Liz whispered, tears streaming down her face. But the victory was short-lived. The ground trembled again, and the tree's melody returned, louder and more powerful than before. "It's not enough," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "We have to burn it." Will pulled a flare from his pack and ignited it, the red light casting eerie shadows across the grove. He threw it at the base of the tree, and the bark caught fire immediately. The tree let out one final deafening shriek as the flames consumed it. Friends covered their ears, the sound nearly unbearable. When the flames died down, the grove was silent. The tree was gone, reduced to ashes. The four friends emerged from the woods at dawn, their bodies battered, their minds forever scarred. They vowed never to speak of what had happened, but the memory lingered. Weeks later, Emma woke to the sound of the melody, faint but unmistakable. When she looked outside, she saw a single sapling growing in her backyard. The singing tree was never truly gone. Story 3. The Collector's Gallery. The invitation arrived on a rainy evening, tucked inside an envelope that smelled faintly of aged paper and cedar. Margot, an artist known for her moody landscapes and eerie portraits, was startled when she saw her name scrawled in elegant calligraphy. She didn't recall submitting her work to any galleries recently, yet the letter invited her to a private showing at the Collector's Gallery, an establishment she'd never heard of. It was unusual, but Margot was curious. The note promised the event would showcase art unlike anything you've ever seen. As someone who lived for creativity and thrived on the unusual, she found it impossible to resist. She convinced herself it was likely a networking opportunity, a chance to meet other artists or perhaps collectors who could elevate her career. The address led her to the outskirts of the city, to a neighborhood she'd never visited before. The gallery stood alone at the end of a narrow cobblestone street, a towering structure that seemed both ancient and timeless. Its facade was black stone, smooth and cold, with no windows visible. A single, gilded door marked the entrance, and above it, the name The Collector's Gallery was etched in flowing script. Margaret hesitated. The building seemed out of place, almost surreal. The hum of the city felt distant here, the air unnaturally still, but she pushed her doubts aside and stepped inside. The interior was magnificent, if unsettling. The walls were adorned with dimly lit sconces, casting flickering shadows that danced like living things. The gallery's floor was polished marble, and the air smelled faintly of varnish and something sweet, like decaying fruit. A man approached her as she entered. He was tall and impossibly elegant, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit. His skin was pale, his eyes a piercing gray that seemed to look straight through her. "Margot," he said, his voice smooth and inviting. "Welcome, we've been expecting you." She opened her mouth to ask how he knew her name, but he gestured for her to follow before she could speak. The main hall was vast, its ceiling disappearing into shadow. Sculptures and paintings lined the walls, each illuminated by a single spotlight. The artwork was extraordinary, hyper-realistic depictions of people in moments of intense emotion. A woman frozen mid-scream, her eyes wide with terror. A man kneeling in despair, his face buried in his hands. A child gazing upward, her expression a mix of wonder and dread. Margot couldn't tear her eyes away. The detail was astonishing, the textures and expressions so lifelike that she half expected the figures to start moving. "These are incredible," she murmured. The man beside her smiled faintly. "The collector is very particular about his acquisitions." She frowned. "The collector? Our curator," he explained. "Each piece in this gallery was personally selected by him. Only the most exceptional works are displayed here." Margot studied him. "Why was I invited?" His smile widened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he led her deeper into the gallery. As they moved from room to room, the artwork grew more unsettling. The sculptures were no longer merely realistic, they were grotesque. Figures twisted in impossible ways, their expressions frozen in agony. Paintings depicted nightmarish landscapes, where figures were consumed by shadows or tangled in webs of sinew and bone. Margot's unease grew. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that art was meant to provoke. But something about these pieces felt wrong, as if they weren't just depictions of suffering, but the suffering itself made manifest. The man stopped in front of a painting larger than the rest, its frame ornate and gilded. The canvas depicted a woman sitting in an empty room, staring at a mirror. Her face was blurred, as though she had been erased. "This one feels different," Margot said, tilting her head. The man studied the painting with an intensity that made her shiver. "It is. What's it called?" "Reflection," he said. Margot glanced at him, waiting for more, but he offered no further explanation. As they continued, she noticed something chilling. The subjects of the artwork looked familiar. A nagging feeling told her she had seen these faces before, not in galleries or museums, but in missing person posters, news articles, and social media pleas. Her stomach churned. She turned to the man, her voice trembling. "These people, are they real?" "They are extraordinary," he replied, as though that answered her question. Margot's pulse quickened. "I think I've seen enough." The man's smile faltered for the first time. "You haven't seen the most important piece." She shook her head, taking a step back. "No, I'd like to leave." His expression hardened. "You cannot leave until you've seen the collector's masterpiece." The words sent a chill down her spine. Before she could argue, he motioned toward a doorway at the end of the hall. Two figures appeared from the shadows, their faces obscured, and moved to block her retreat. Margot's breath quickened. The man gestured again, and the figures flanked her, guiding her toward the doorway. The room beyond was unlike the others. It was circular, the walls lined with mirrors that reflected her from every angle. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it was a sheet-covered object. The man stood beside the pedestal, his movements unnervingly smooth. "This," he said, "is the collector's most prized possession." Margot didn't move. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she was surrounded. "Remove the cover," he instructed, his voice calm yet commanding. Her hands trembled as she stepped forward. She grasped the edges of the sheet and pulled it away. Beneath it was a sculpture of herself. Margot staggered back, her mind reeling. The sculpture was perfect, every detail captured with unnerving precision. Her wide eyes, her parted lips, the faint scar above her eyebrow. "This can't be real," she whispered. The man's smile returned. "It is. Do you not see?" he asked, his tone almost gentle. "You were chosen, Margot. The collector saw the potential in you. Your essence will become part of his eternal collection." She shook her head, panic clawing at her throat. "No, I'm leaving." The man sighed. "You cannot leave, Margot. Not never." The mirrors around her began to ripple like water, and her reflection in each one started to change. In one, her face was contorted with fear. In another, she was screaming silently. In yet another, her expression was empty, devoid of life. The room grew colder, the air thick with a palpable energy. Margot turned to run, but the figures from before blocked her path. "Please," she begged, "you can't do this." The man tilted his head, his gray eyes filled with something between pity and indifference. "It is already done." The mirrors began to glow faintly, and the sculpture of Margot shimmered as though it were alive. She felt a strange pull, as if her very being were being drawn toward it. "No!" she screamed, fighting against the invisible force. The room filled with a deafening hum, and the last thing Margot saw was her own face reflected 1,000 times, each version staring back with an expression of despair. When the light faded, the room was empty. The pedestal remained, the sculpture of Margot now lifeless but perfect in every detail. The man straightened his suit and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the silent gallery. The collector's masterpiece was complete. Weeks later, an envelope arrived at another artist's door, inviting them to the collector's gallery. The cycle would begin anew. Story 4. The Shattered Clock. The old grandfather clock arrived at their doorstep on an overcast morning, wrapped in layers of protective cloth and tied with a weathered ribbon. Meredith didn't recall ordering such a thing, and neither did her husband, Sam. It stood tall and imposing, its dark mahogany wood gleaming despite its apparent age. The clock face was ornate, with Roman numerals carved so delicately they seemed to shimmer under the light. There was no return address on the packaging, only a handwritten note tucked beneath the ribbon. To the Mitchells, may this mark the start of many timeless memories. Treat it well. Sam joked that perhaps it was a gift from an eccentric admirer of their newly renovated home. Meredith, ever the skeptic, wasn't so sure, but the clock was beautiful, and their living room seemed to welcome it. They placed it against the far wall, its pendulum swinging smoothly as it chimed softly, marking every hour. First, they thought nothing of it. The clock added a sense of charm to the house, its rhythmic ticking becoming a soothing background noise. But as days passed, the clock began to feel less like a gift and more like an unwelcome presence. It started with the chiming. At first, the sound was beautiful, a deep and resonant tone that seemed to echo throughout the house. Then it grew louder. By the second night, it chimed long past its allotted sequence, ringing 12 times at midnight, then 13, then 14. Sam dismissed it as a mechanical issue. "These old clocks are temperamental," he said, pulling up a video tutorial on how to adjust the mechanisms. But when he opened the clock to inspect its gears, there was nothing unusual, just a pristine, untouched interior. By the fourth night, the chimes were joined by whispers, faint at first, like the murmur of wind through leaves, but unmistakably voices. Meredith woke at precisely midnight to hear them. She padded into the living room, where the clock's pendulum swayed hypnotically. The whispers grew louder as she approached, fragmented words slipping through the air like smoke. Soon, watching Time Is Ours, she backed away, her heart pounding. But when she called Sam to listen, the voices were gone. The next morning, Meredith suggested moving the clock out of the house. Sam, ever the pragmatist, laughed it off. "It's just a clock, Mer. You've been overthinking things." But Meredith couldn't shake the unease that followed her. The sensation that the clock's ticking wasn't just mechanical, but alive, sentient, watching. That evening she noticed something else. Their daughter, Ellie, who had been captivated by the clock when it first arrived, now avoided the living room entirely. "Ellie, what's wrong?" Meredith asked as the 6-year-old sat at the kitchen table, coloring quietly. Ellie looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "The man in the clock doesn't like me." Meredith's blood ran cold. "What man?" Ellie pointed to the living room. "He's inside. He watches from the glass when you're not looking." Meredith rushed to check the clock, her fingers trembling as she swung open the wooden door. There was nothing inside but the pendulum, its steady rhythm mocking her. That night, she convinced Sam to sleep in the guest room with Ellie, leaving Meredith alone in their bedroom. She lay awake, every creak and groan of the house amplified in the dark. At midnight, the clock began to chime. 3. By the 12th chime, she was already sitting upright, her heart pounding. But the clock didn't stop. 13, 14, 15. The whispers returned, louder this time. Words she couldn't make sense of, overlapping and chaotic. Meredith crept out of bed, her legs weak beneath her. She reached the living room to find the clock glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly light spilling from its face. She stared into the glass, and for the first time, she saw it, a shadow moving behind the pendulum. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Something was inside the clock. Meredith slammed the wooden door shut and backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. The clock fell silent, its pendulum slowing until it came to a complete stop. The house was quiet for the first time in days, but the silence was worse than the noise. The next morning, Sam found her sitting on the couch, pale and wide-eyed. She told him everything, about the whispers, the chimes, and the shadow inside the clock. "Mer, you're exhausted," Sam said, though his own unease was evident. "Maybe we should get rid of it, just in case." Tried to move it later that day. Sam grabbed the base, but it wouldn't budge. The clock was heavier than it had any right to be, as if it had rooted itself to the floor. Meredith's phone buzzed, and she answered it with trembling hands. It was the antique dealer they had contacted earlier, offering to take the clock. "What you're describing sounds like a sentinel clock," the dealer said, his voice grave. "They were rare, built centuries ago as ritual objects. Some say they were cursed." Meredith's throat tightened. "What kind of curse?" The dealer hesitated. "They were said to guard against something, or someone. But if the clock is disrupted, it doesn't just stop time, it opens a door." Meredith didn't tell Sam everything the dealer said. She didn't need to. The events of that night spoke for themselves. At midnight, the chimes began again, but this time they weren't alone. Whispers turned to wails, and the clock's glass face cracked, a single fracture splitting it like a wound. The lights in the house flickered, and the air grew cold enough to frost the windows. Ellie screamed from the guest room, and Sam bolted out of bed. They found her huddled under the blankets, pointing to the doorway. "He's coming," Ellie sobbed. "The man in the clock is coming." The clock's chimes grew erratic, overlapping and distorted, as if time itself was breaking apart. The glass shattered, and a figure emerged, stepping out of the clock as if through a portal. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, its face obscured by a swirling shadow. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space like heat waves. Sam grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it at the figure, but the metal passed through harmlessly. The creature turned its hollow gaze toward him, and Sam froze in place, his eyes wide with terror. Meredith grabbed Ellie and ran, pulling her into the kitchen. She rifled through the drawers until she found a hammer. The dealer's words echoed in her mind. "If the clock is disrupted, it opens a door." She sprinted back to the living room, where the creature loomed over Sam, its shadowy form wrapping around him like smoke. Meredith raised the hammer and swung it at the clock, shattering the pendulum. The creature let out an unearthly scream, its form rippling as the clock's frame splintered. The room was consumed by a blinding light, and then silence. When Meredith opened her eyes, the clock was gone. The living room was intact, but the air felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Sam lay on the floor, unconscious but breathing. Ellie clung to Meredith, her small body trembling. They moved out the next day, leaving the house and its horrors behind. But Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Weeks later, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a single fragment of the clock's shattered glass. Etched into the surface were the words, "Time will find you." Story 5, The Tunnel of Echoes. The entrance to the abandoned subway tunnel was overgrown with ivy, hidden behind layers of rusted fencing and warning signs. For years, rumors circulated about the old line, an ambitious project halted decades ago after a tragic collapse claimed the lives of over 30 workers. Locals spoke of voices in the dark, whispers that called out to anyone who dared venture close. They called it the Tunnel of Echoes, a name spoken with both fear and fascination. For Mason, Riley, Claire, and Ethan, urban exploration was a thrill they couldn't resist. Their YouTube channel, Uncharted Realms, was dedicated to uncovering the world's forgotten and eerie places. When a subscriber tipped them off about the tunnel, claiming it was one of the most haunted locations in the country, they couldn't resist. They arrived at dusk, the sky a muted gray as rain threatened to fall. The entrance to the tunnel was as foreboding as they had imagined, the air around it cooler than the surrounding woods. Mason, the de facto leader of the group, hoisted his backpack and turned to the others. "This is it. We get some footage, explore for a couple of hours, and we're out. No heroics." Claire smirked, adjusting her camera. "You're the one who always ends up doing something stupid for views." Riley, the team skeptic, rolled his eyes. "If we see anything, it'll be rats, maybe a vagrant or two." Ethan, the quietest of the group, checked the battery on his flashlight. "Let's just be careful. This place doesn't feel right." The moment they stepped inside, the world seemed to shift. The tunnel swallowed the fading light, its walls coated in grime and streaked with decades of neglect. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent. As they ventured deeper, the sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the tunnel itself was listening. Mason narrated into his camera. "We're about 100 feet in, and already the vibe is unsettling. You can see the remnants of construction equipment, broken beams, rusted tools, the perfect setting for a haunting. Claire captured close-ups of the graffiti lining the walls, some of it faded and indecipherable, others fresh enough to suggest recent visitors. But one symbol caught her eye, a jagged spiral etched repeatedly, its lines crude and uneven. "Hey, check this out," she called, zooming in on the symbol. Ethan frowned. "Looks ritualistic." "Or just some wannabe cult," Riley added dismissively. They pressed on, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The deeper they went, the more the tunnel seemed to change. The walls grew closer together, the air colder. The echoes of their footsteps became distorted, blending with faint whispers. Claire paused, her grip tightening on the camera. "Did you hear that?" Mason stopped and turned, his flashlight illuminating her pale face. "Hear what?" "Voices," she said. "Like whispers." Riley scoffed. "Probably just the wind." But Mason listened closely. The whispers weren't random, they had a cadence, almost like words just out of reach. Ethan stepped closer to Mason. "This feels wrong. Maybe we should turn back." Mason shook his head, his curiosity outweighing his unease. "We came here for a reason. Let's at least make it to the main collapse site. That's where people say the activity is strongest." Reluctantly, the group continued. The whispers grew louder, intertwining with the sound of their movements. At first, it was easy to dismiss them as echoes, but soon the voices began to differentiate. Some were deep and guttural, others high-pitched and frantic. Claire shone her flashlight at the ground and froze. "Mason, before them was a gaping hole, the remnants of the collapse that had ended construction decades ago. Jagged beams jutted out like broken ribs, and water pooled at the bottom, reflecting their light in unsettling ripples." Mason aimed his camera down into the pit. "This is it, the heart of the tunnel's history." As they filmed, the whispers grew, deafening. Riley clutched his head, wincing. "Do you hear that? It's like they're inside my skull." Claire nodded, her face pale. "They're saying something." The group fell silent, straining to listen. The voices weren't just echoes anymore. They were calling their names. Mason's flashlight flickered, the beam narrowing and stretching unnaturally. "We need to keep moving. There's got to be more ahead." Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Maybe we should." A sudden, sharp scream echoed from deeper in the tunnel, cutting him off. It wasn't any of them. Without thinking, Mason sprinted toward the sound. "Come on!" The others followed reluctantly, their fear mounting. The tunnel seemed to shift around them, the walls curving in ways that defied logic. The ground became uneven, forcing them to slow their pace. They reached a massive chamber, where the tunnel opened into a cavernous space. In the center stood an old railway car, its metal sides rusted and corroded. The air around it shimmered faintly, like heat waves rising from asphalt. Mason approached the car cautiously, his camera capturing every detail. "What is this doing here? There's no way it was left behind accidentally." Claire circled the car, her flashlight revealing jagged scratches along its surface. "These look like claw marks." Ethan kept his distance, his breathing shallow. "I don't think we should be here." Riley leaned closer to the car's door, squinting at the dark interior. "It's empty." "See," as if in response, the door creaked open. The group froze, their flashlights trained on the opening. Inside, the darkness seemed to pulse, alive with a presence they couldn't see. Mason stepped forward, his curiosity overriding his fear. "Hello, is anyone in there?" The only reply was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air. Claire grabbed his arm. We don't know what's inside." But it was too late. Mason stepped into the car, his flashlight illuminating nothing but more darkness. The door slammed shut behind him. Claire screamed, pounding on the metal. "Mason, can you hear me?" Inside the car, Mason was plunged into an oppressive silence. His flashlight flickered, revealing brief flashes of the interior. He saw faces, twisted, screaming faces pressed against the walls. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. Panic set in as the car began to tremble. The walls seemed to close in, and the faces grew closer, their empty eyes locking onto him. Outside, the others tried desperately to open the door. The whispers in the tunnel grew louder, forming a cacophony that drowned out their own voices. Ethan stumbled backward, his face pale. It's not letting him go. Riley grabbed a crowbar from his pack, wedging it into the door's edge. "Help me!" Claire joined him, their combined strength forcing the door open just enough for Mason to collapse out. He was shaking, his face drenched in sweat. "We need to leave." Now they didn't argue. As they retraced their steps, the tunnel seemed to fight them. The walls shifted, passages closing off and new ones appearing. The whispers grew more frantic, their voices overlapping and desperate. The group stumbled into a narrow corridor, their flashlights barely cutting through the thickening darkness. Mason fell to his knees, clutching his head. "It's in my mind. I can feel it." Claire knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "What happened in there?" He looked up, his eyes haunted. "It showed me us, our memories, our fears. It's feeding off them." The whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and commanding. "Stay with us. You belong here." Ethan turned to the others, his voice shaking. "It's the workers, the ones who died here. They're trapped, and they want us to join them." The walls trembled, dust and debris falling from the ceiling. Riley grabbed Mason, pulling him to his feet. "We're not staying. Let's move." They ran blindly, the tunnel's layout shifting around them. It was as if the space itself was alive, determined to keep them from escaping. Claire's flashlight died, plunging her into darkness. She screamed, her voice echoing unnaturally. The others turned to find her gone. Ethan shouted her name, his voice breaking. "Claire, where are you?" Her scream echoed again, this time from a different direction. The group split up, Mason and Riley taking one path while Ethan followed the sound. Mason and Riley found themselves in another chamber, this one filled with old machinery. The air was heavy with the scent of rust and oil, and the whispers were deafening. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, its form shifting and indistinct. Riley raised his flashlight, his hand trembling. "Who's there?" The shadow lunged, and the light flickered out. Ethan followed Claire's voice, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. He found her huddled in a corner, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. "They're everywhere." The ground beneath them cracked, and they fell into darkness. When Mason woke, he was alone. The tunnel was silent, the whispers gone. He staggered to his feet, his flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. As he moved, he saw them, his friends, their faces etched into the walls. Their eyes followed him, their mouths moving in silent screams. The tunnel led him back to the railway car, its door open and waiting. The voice returned, calm and patient. "You cannot leave. Your time is ours now." Mason stepped inside. The tunnel fell silent once more, waiting for its next explorers.